looks right, throws a deep pass, right side, end zone, it's caught, it's a touchdown. And the Cardinals continue to pour it on.
Welcome to Cardinals Underground.
Well, not to get all Pauly profound off the top, but, you know, there's the known and then there's the unknown. And this NFL season, unlike any other, for example, I'll give you a little tiny example here, Darren Urban, Kyle Odegard. We do know that the Pro Bowl 2021 will be held in Vegas, at least as scheduled accordingly, no longer in Orlando, and Hawaii is a thing of the past. Wolf, he sold his condo a long time ago. Don't believe that, by the way. Now it's in Vegas. The question is, the known and the unknown, will the Cardinals actually play in Vegas, gentlemen? We know the end of the season of the Pro Bowl is scheduled for Vegas, but the Cardinals are scheduled to open that building in Vegas. Will that happen? Will it not? We don't absolutely know that, Darren. And so, you know, these are just one of many questions. Mentally, how are you handling this? Give us some advice. Now, in your 21st year covering the Cardinals, Darren, I mean, mentally, how should we equip ourselves to proceed?
Well, I'm not going to lie, Paul. Mentally, I'm struggling this much like everybody else in the world is. I'm struggling with normal life and certainly with how our jobs are going to go because I think the NFL, just like all the sports, are trying to figure out how this is all going to play out. And unfortunately, with what we do, we seem to be lower on the totem pole in terms of figuring out how it's going to work for us since, you know, they want to figure out how they're actually going to get players on the field. The Vegas question is a great question. When, you know, I was thinking 8 months ago, I had talked to some people in the building. I'm like, you know, the Cardinals often play the Raiders in the preseason. They were kind of on the docket for having the Cardinals go to play at the Raiders. So I'm like, oh, we might get to go to Vegas. Then it happens, you're in the new stadium, or you're supposed to be in the new stadium, and now you realize it's supposed to be the second game of the preseason, and the reality is that could get wiped away. And quite frankly, even if it doesn't get wiped away, are any of us going to be included in that trip anyway? So I don't know. I mean, I can just do a big shrug of the shoulders because I'm as clueless as everybody else at this point.
Yeah, the Raiders unveiled a picture. They put their logo at the middle of the field on the field tray. And it's interesting, Kyle, because Michael Bidwell told us on an edition of Big Red Rage not too long ago that Mark Davis and the Raiders had consulted with the Cardinals quite a bit. A lot of the challenges of having a field tray, for example, growing grass in the desert, and what exactly, you know, some of the best practices that you need to follow, and just opening a building and so forth. So, you know, I mean, I'm fired up. I'd love to see that building. I've seen it from afar. I was in Vegas right before the pandemic hit on a spring break, and it looks great. But once again, like everything else, it's a complete unknown right now as to exactly what late July and the month of August will entail.
Definitely a huge unknown. I will say, if somebody needs to volunteer to go to Vegas after 6 months of stay at home, I'll be the nice guy and go ahead and go cover the game. If you want to fly me out a few days early just to get the lay of the land, if the strip is open, let me know.
And Kyle won't even need.
I was going to say, Kyle, what if we end up telling you got to drive?
I can drive too. It's like 4 hours.
And Darren, he won't need a hotel room. He'll just be up for a good 48 straight hours. He'll just
can't do that anymore.
I'll be honest, Paul. I'm like you're like I was in Vegas pre-COVID, and I'm thinking I'm picturing you at like Fat Tuesdays, downing them at like 1:30 in the afternoon, just wandering the strip.
That's where we were when all the news reports started coming across.
Wow.
And we learned that Phoenix was starting to shut down. I saw a video of the craziness at Walmart and Costco, people fighting in line that goes around the building, and we were in Vegas. And so, in fact, and this is a true story, we're trying to figure out what to do, and I was down at the front desk, and because everyone had bolted and there was no one left in the hotel, they literally gave us another night for free on the house. So like, well, just use the room. And it turns out, I mean, the entire casino was like empty. And then we drove home the next day. You know, we had already, disinfected the room El Grande like 400 times, believe me.
I was going to say you especially.
Yeah. So that's just the norm. I mean, before the even pandemic hit, I mean, it was already disinfected. So then we doubled down on that. So here I am, thankfully, living to tell about it. But it looked really cool. That building looked really cool. This offseason, though, the only other thing I can think about to compare this offseason would be the lockout, right, Darren? I mean, and look, they navigated through that. The brand of football that year, if memory serves, it was a little rough in the month of September. But you know what? We've had rough football in the regular season to start every regular season for pretty much the last decade because nobody plays in the preseason anymore. So I don't think we're necessarily going to see the effects of this offseason necessarily in the first 2 weeks of the regular season. We've already been dealing with that dynamic.
I think that's a great point about how, especially because so many guys don't play that much in the preseason, it can be a little rough right out of the box. I mean, how many times have we talked when we get into the regular season and we talk about how those first 2 weeks, we're not sure exactly what that'll mean for the rest of the year, because oftentimes there are teams that get off to a great start for whatever reason and they quickly fall off, or a team gets off to a slower start and they kick it into gear like they should because they've kind of figured some things out. 2011 was similar in the idea that there wasn't any on-field work. Obviously in 2011, there was no virtual meetings either. I just remember, other than the brief moments during the summer, there was the rookies did come in. The Cardinals drafted Patrick Peterson that year, and he was flown in for a press conference. He was allowed to do that because he wasn't under contract yet, so he wasn't a member of the union, so he could be at the facility. And then I also remember briefly there was a stay. I believe it was a legal maneuver by the Players Association that allowed the players to show up at the facility one random day. And I remember going outside to take pictures of like DRC and Darnell Dockett, flipping tires and doing some workouts and keeping my fingers crossed it was going to stick. Now it didn't, and then the lockout went back to being the lockout the very next day until we got to camp. And then camp was a whole thing. And that's the one difference that I think of when we're talking about now as opposed to then. I mean, obviously, COVID is going to impact this camp greatly that you didn't have to worry about in 2011, but at least all the rosters are set and the coaches know who they've got. In 2011, because it was a CBA problem, the lockout began as soon as the new league year started. So there was no free agency, no trades were allowed, no signings could happen. So when you got to the point where they agreed on a CBA, which was essentially right around the time teams were physically supposed to go to camp, you had this flurry of roster activity, and the Kevin Cobb trade was made by the Cardinals, and you had to sign all your free agents then. So you had this influx of new guys that weren't even going to be around. I mean, Tim Hightower had been a big part of that team for 3 years at that point, and they traded him away in the midst of everything. And I remember he was a one line of a note, his trade away in the middle of camp, because there were so many other things that were going on at the time. And it would have been a bigger story had it happened in, March or April.
In that 24-hour window where the Cardinals did report, didn't they somehow manage, though, to get a playbook to Kevin Cobb? Honestly, didn't they? Wasn't that how they got? Because think about that. The Cardinals were breaking in a new quarterback. At the time, a new franchise quarterback, they thought. Yeah. And they didn't have the luxury, just like now, of a traditional offseason. It was even worse then. You couldn't have any contact with your guys.
I mean, I don't know anything specifically, but let's face it. I mean, I'm not 100% sure everybody was kind of working as best they could to make sure they overcome the hurdles that were presented to them. I mean, I had a question in the mailbag about if the Cardinals, knew they were going to trade for Kevin Cobb, and it was kind of an open secret that there was a good chance it was going to happen. I don't think they had agreed to anything during the lockout, but I don't think it was a super shock. I mean, it was in the context of, did they take Patrick Peterson knowing they were going to trade away Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie? Now, there was a lot of things that went into this. I think Patrick Peterson was potentially the best player in that draft, other than maybe Cam Newton, who went number 1 overall. That was such a significant and fantastic draft, but I think they were going to take Patrick Peterson where they were picking anyways, whether they traded DRC or not. And the other thing too is DRC was coming off not a very good year. He kind of regressed in 2010, and I think he had frustrated a lot of the coaches. So it wasn't like they felt like he was this next level person that they had to give up for Kevin Cobb. But that all being said, were they happy they took Patrick Peterson and were ready in case they did give up a cornerback like DRC? Yeah, I think that was part of it. And so there was a lot of moving pieces at the time.
We all remember that season opener. Carolina came to the Cardinals and Cam Newton threw for like 400-something yards and really just blew us away. Nobody expected him to do that. Cardinals hung on and won that game. And I still remember Patrick Peterson getting quite an indoctrination into the league, having to go against Steve Smith and literally like hand-to-hand combat for 4 quarters against Steve Smith, the Tasmanian Devil. That was unbelievable. Think about that, though, Kyle. The Cardinals don't have to deal with any of that because Kyler Murray and Cliff Kingsbury are in year 2. To what degree, in your opinion, do you think that's the gift that keeps on giving this season?
I think that's going to help them quite a bit. I mean, you have continuity, you have a comfort level between coach and quarterback, and really the entire offense is going to be feeling pretty good about where they are. I just feel like the dominant theme early on is not going to be so much the play on the field, but all the effects around them. Like, are there going to be fans? Is somebody going to get the coronavirus and have to be quarantined and not play in the opener? And all these kind of things that are swirling around the actual football, because that's the great unknown. I mean, once they got back from the lockout, it seemed like it was kind of like, okay, that's over. Let's get back to business as usual. But this is the type of thing that is going to linger maybe all season. I mean, it's so unknown what's going to happen moving forward that I think that's the big question is what is this season going to look like as a whole?
I mean, Kyle, frankly put, what's going to be different next month that isn't different the month after? There's a lot of doctors predicting a fall surge or second wave, which ostensibly is why baseball didn't want to play into November. But in the absence of a development of an effective treatment, and without a realistic chance at a vaccine until next year, this is just something that I'm guessing is going to be a season-long challenge here in 2020.
Yeah, and like you look at the NBA and the proposal there of putting everybody in a bubble for a couple months, but they're more than halfway through their season and they can truncate what's going on. If the NFL wants to play a full season, it's not feasible to lock everybody down 24 hours a day. So the odds are that people are going to get coronavirus, and then how does that impact the team? I think there's a million scenarios that could happen, a bunch of hurdles to jump over, and I just think we all have to expect the unexpected, where this is kind of the thinking right now, but as we've seen over the last few months, it changes rapidly. Like we were hoping that coronavirus cases in Arizona would go down with the summer heat, and that hasn't happened. The rate is going up. So there's so much going on that I think everybody's just on their toes and waiting to see what's next.
You know, one of the most interesting stories I've read was about Michigan football, and they've instituted a players dorm and then a quarantine dorm, and they're going to separate it. And it's also going to be for some students as well on campus. And if indeed you're diagnosed positive, you go into the quarantine dorm for X number of days or weeks. And then when you test negative 2 or 3 times, you come back out and you rejoin the team. And it was Chris Hutchinson, who you might remember the name if you're a big-time football fan. He was the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year in 1992, and he's now a doctor in the Detroit area. He's been on the front lines in the emergency rooms, in the hospitals during COVID-19, and his son is a big-time player on that Michigan defense. And so everyone's flocked to him and asked, are you going to let your son play? And he said, absolutely. I've been on the front lines and experienced this. And I'm comfortable with my son playing with these sort of protocols and what Michigan has set up. And so I'm hoping, Darren, I think we're all hoping that, that has staying power, and that's going to be an effective approach to football here this year.
What concerns me isn't necessarily that somebody's going to get it, because as we were just talking about, somebody's probably going to get it. And I'm even talking about beyond, if you lose a star player because he's got to get quarantined. I mean, it's a pain in the butt, and it wouldn't be good for whatever team, but you can kind of deal with that. What happens if somebody gets really sick? That's the question that I kind of wonder about. And fortunately, it seems like when we hear about players right now, for the most part, so many of them we're hearing stories about they get it, but they're asymptomatic, or, you know, they're bedridden for a couple of days or whatever. So I guess that's kind of where we'll have to see where it goes. But, you know, I'm with all you guys. I mean, you're not going to eradicate it by the time, you know, whenever. So you either got to not play at all, or you're going to have to understand that this is kind of where we are. And so I'm leaving it up to players, and if they're comfortable with it, do it. And we'll kind of have to see, just like all these other leagues, the NFLPA and the NFL have to come to an agreement on how all this is going to be dealt with. And I do think it's interesting, you know, the NFL came out with its rules, but Roger Goodell was on ESPN recently and basically said, look, we're putting these things out, we're getting feedback, and we're going to kind of sort it out from there. So it's also possible that what we know is going to be the protocols or how this is going to go are going to change, and maybe change multiple times before we even get to training camp.
And that is the next stop now, Kyle, is training camp. Which player and or position group do you think was hurt the most on this Cardinals roster by the lack of a traditional offseason? Who do you think has the most catching up to do, so to speak?
I don't know if it's catching up to do as much as showing his worth. I think Andy Isabella is the guy that stands out to me, where if he showed that things clicked this offseason, I mean, he's got skills and he's got traits that didn't translate as a rookie. If he did a lot of that stuff, I think Cliff Kingsbury would have thought hard about ways to get him incorporated. And he's right on that ledge of, can he be a key contributor or not, being the fourth receiver, where you have to work in ways to get him the ball, because he's not naturally going to be on the field unless you do run a bunch of 10 personnel. So I feel like this offseason would have been big for him if he showed that, hey, I'm this big time deep threat, give me the ball on jet sweeps, throw me bubble screens, I can make it happen. And maybe my route running has improved. And for him, you can't count on that because you haven't seen him do it yet. And we've still got camp, and there's going to be several weeks for guys to show that. But as Cliff Kingsbury said earlier this offseason, he has to get all these veterans ready to go. And you know who your top three receivers are, and you need to get Kyler Murray going well with DeAndre Hopkins, Larry Fitzgerald, and Christian Kirk. So my question is, can Andy Isabella make enough of an impact in that truncated period to become a key performer on offense?
And we've talked about this, Darren, in the offseason. I mean, there are position groups that can't show anything, the lineman, for example. But receiver is a position where you can show that you've made progress. I mean, Steve Breston, once upon a time, made a huge jump from year one to year two and was a big part of the Cardinals offense, much more than just a return man in his second year in the NFL.
And I think Andy Isabella is somebody who's itching to kind of show. I mean, he's quiet and he understands he didn't do a whole lot, but the few times I've kind of interacted with him, you can kind of tell he's a little irritated that people don't think he can do it. So, you know, he's still got to prove it. But I agree with you. He could have really flashed this offseason and helped himself. Now, while it's all true, Cliff Kingsbury's got to get his veterans ready. This is a team that didn't make any significant additions other than DeAndre Hopkins, which is not insignificant, but they didn't do anything else to push off those other draft picks. They didn't draft another receiver. So I think it's set up for one of those guys to be able to be looked at very carefully and move forward, whether it's Keyshawn Johnson or Akeem Butler or Andy Isabella. Now, I think given his draft status, they'd love for it to be Andy Isabella, but like Kyle said, that he's going to have to prove it.
Yeah, Akeem Butler, no doubt as well. You know, Akeem Butler could have shown a lot in the offseason just in terms of his comprehension of the offense, stuff that he had no chance to do last year. He was out of the equation. How about Isaiah Simmons? You want to talk draft picks? You know, Wolf and I got into this, Ron Wolfley, about Devondre Campbell. And to me, as talented as Isaiah Simmons is, Darren, is it realistic to think that he could be a viable day one starter and actually beat out a Devondre Campbell? When Campbell is, not only does he have the skills, but he has 4 years of experience. And to me, at least, the coaches would look at him as much more of a sure thing in terms of his assignments and not being a liability and maybe in deep coverage against tight ends to begin with. I don't know. I have much more respect about the NFL game coming from the college game than I used to, maybe more so than ever. And just as a rookie, even when you're incredibly talented like Isaiah Simmons, that is so tough, I think, to beat out a guy in his prime like a Devondre Campbell.
Especially when they went and signed him. And like you said, I mean, he's already proven himself. I mean, I'm not a big fan of saying you shouldn't play a rookie, period, because they're not ready or whatever. And I think the Cardinals have had some coaches like that over the years. But if you look, I mean, Vance Joseph is a guy who's been around this league and would tend to probably trust veterans a little bit more. Bill Davis, the linebackers coach, tends to probably want to lean towards veterans. I'm not saying that Isaiah Simmons doesn't get a chance, but I would agree with you that Devondre Campbell is a guy that it's going to be hard. He's going to be hard pressed to overcome, given that Isaiah Simmons is going to have to learn on the fly, and Devondre Campbell already kind of knows what he's doing and is a smart guy. I mean, I think of it in the same kind of scenario as the Cardinals have at right tackle. I mean, you might want Josh Jones to be your guy at right tackle, but without an offseason, I mean, even with an offseason, it would have been tough. But without an offseason, if Marcus Gilbert is healthy, heck, even if Justin Murray is that guy, they're going to have that experience that shortens the learning curve that these rookies just don't have. And I would think that in a truncated preseason with no off-season on-field work, that coaches are going to want to go with what makes them comfortable. And it sure feels like veterans would make them more comfortable in the short term.
I mean, if I'm Cliff Kingsbury, Kyle, and it's week 1 at the Niners and you're going against, Bosa and company and that Niners pass rush, there's a lot of trepidation for me going with a rookie, Josh Jones, no matter how talented he might be, over a veteran like Marcus Gilbert, who's had the luxury of knowing what he's in store for in a regular season game. I just view that as a monumental challenge for a kid like Josh Jones to beat out a veteran like Marcus Gilbert, no matter how skilled he might be.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to camp and he shows he's right there, and then maybe you consider it. But we've seen a lot of rookie offensive linemen come through, and there's a lot of talk about them when they get drafted, and then you get to camp, and those guys are far behind the veterans. There's a distinct learning curve, especially at that position. So I would be very surprised if Marcus Gilbert or Justin Murray were surpassed by Josh Jones. And going back to Isaiah Simmons, I think he's the type of guy, I don't think he's going to usurp Devondre Campbell, just because, like you guys talked about, Campbell was paid a pretty decent amount of coin in free agency. If this was a Joe Walker situation, more of a career fringe backup type player, then yeah, I think the opportunity would have been there. But Devondre Campbell has been a starter for several years, and the more likely scenario for me is you look at week 1 and Isaiah Simmons, maybe the entire thought is in passing downs, we shadow George Kittle with Isaiah Simmons and make his game plan very specific to what he needs to do, or in a certain situation on third down, you're just rushing the passer. But from an overall standpoint, I think there's too much to learn in the short period of camp for him to reasonably be a full-time starter that early.
Anywhere else on this roster, Darren, that you think, okay, you know what, the offseason particularly hurt this player or this position per se? How about the 2 rookie defensive linemen in the 4th round? Just the fact you have some veterans now and you've solidified the depth in that D line room. Do you think it's more difficult than ever, just the absence of an offseason and no rookie minicamp, for example, for the 2 rookies on the D line to make an instant impact?
I don't think there's any – all the rookies, I think, are going to be hurt by this. I think the one good thing about the rookie defensive linemen is the fact that you do have enough veterans around them that all they're being asked to do is really be rotational guys. So that might help. Other places that I'm looking at, like, okay, it would have been nice to see Robert Alford run around coming off the injury, maybe do some things. I would have liked to – I think given the circumstances and kind of how they – talked about him, I think Dan Arnold being able to have an offseason in this offense, given that it seems like they would like for him to become a weapon, that would have helped quite a bit too. So I absolutely think, here and there's going to be spots beyond the rookies that it could hurt them. I mean, Alford's a little bit of a different situation because he's played so much, but Arnold really hasn't played a lot. So, would you like to have gotten him some reps? Yeah.
What about Hassan Reddick? Kyle. What about Hassan Reddick going from inside back to outside? And do you think the coaches would have liked to have gotten a little better sense of where he's at going back to that position? Because there has been some speculation as to whether we should expect a time sign at that position and in that position group. What do you think about Hassan Reddick and his standing going into this camp?
I think that's a really good one where if Hassan Reddick came in, and you're not in pads in the offseason, so you can't totally tell, but if he made you feel good, I think we know what Hassan Reddick's skill set is, where he seems like a situational pass rusher. You're not going to use him in a base defense because he's too small, but he has that pass rush ability, and you would, if you saw enough in the offseason, you'd feel really good about Devon Kennard and Hassan Reddick as that duo opposite Chandler Jones. But I agree with you where it's an unknown right now. Hassan Reddick, you saw him for a couple weeks late in the season at outside linebacker, but that's all the reps he got. So I think it's an important year for him to try to show that. I don't think he's ever going to live up to his first round status, but to be a guy who can find a spot in the NFL, and we'll see where it goes. But yeah, I think the training camp is going to be important for him to show right away, hey, I can be that third down pass rusher.
We know on paper, Patrick Peterson's awful bullish on this team. Any holes stand out to you? If you're Steve Keim, Darren, what do you think? Is that outside linebacker room in need of some depth? Is there another safety, perhaps, veteran safety you think or expect might be added to this roster? Where do you think the decision makers are looking right now?
I mean, I think the good part about this roster right now is I don't see a position where you're like, wow, they didn't get a starter for that spot. I mean, obviously they have starters for the spot, but we all know it's like Kyle was saying, with all due respect to Joe Walker, if you were going into this offseason thinking Joe Walker is going to be your starter, even if Isaiah Simmons was coming up behind him, okay, that's a hole to me. I don't know if there is that hole. I mean, unless you want to talk about the unknown at right tackle. We didn't really talk about Mason Cole much. I mean, I think they've been kind of grooming him to be this center, and he has started an entire season before. I still think he's got some things to prove, but I think when I think of the entire starting 22, I don't say to myself, oh, well, that one place, they don't have it. Now, like you said, could they get a veteran safety? Maybe. Could they upgrade a little bit more on the outside linebacker? Maybe. But they signed Devon Kennard to be that starter. I mean, he signed right at the outset of free agency or right after he got cut, which was right in that thing. You don't sign a guy that fast unless you feel confident he can be that starting guy. So anybody they're signing now, to me, is about depth. I don't think there's anybody they're like, oh my God, we messed up on this and we're going to have to fill that hole. With the caveat, of course, that they didn't see anybody on the field that made them say, oh my God, we got to fill this hole. So I guess in training camp, maybe that could change the minds, but I don't necessarily see anybody like that right now.
You know, Kyle, I glossed right over Mason Cole. I think that's a good observation by Darren. And I'll just throw this out there. We went into last year thinking it was going to be a battle between Mason Cole and AQ Shipley, and AQ Shipley ended that pretty quickly. He was the starter, and they made the decision only a week into camp or so, and it really wasn't as much of a competition as we thought. Is it more of a competition perhaps between Mason Cole and a Lamont Gilliard, for example, who was a 4-year starter at Georgia coming off his rookie year, where we didn't hear or see much of him? But do you think internally with the Cardinals that could be a position that's more of a battle than perhaps we expect or we've covered?
It's hard to know with Lamont Gilliard because we've never seen him play a game. He's kind of been in the shadows for a long time, but I do think not signing AQ Shipley again does say something about their confidence in Mason Cole. It's not like you would have to break the bank to sign AQ Shipley. He would have come back, I'm sure, for $1 million or whatever, $1.5 million. So I think they're saying that we like what we saw from Mason Cole and we have confidence in him, and the fact that they keep mentioning him as the clear-cut guy. I mean, nobody's ever said, hey, we're looking at a center competition. I think that's a good sign for him, and he's got experience, and he obviously lost the competition last year, but he's the right age and he's got some good experience. So I think he's certainly the leader in the clubhouse, and he has to seize it. And if he doesn't, then maybe AQ Shipley is a thought again, or Lamont Gilliard shows he can play. But for now, I feel like Mason Cole is certainly the guy they project to play center.
Eno Benjamin. I think we all watched Eno Benjamin, Darren. I know you did quite a bit, and we're intrigued not only by his skill set, but how it fits this offense. But the lack of a regular offseason, how far behind do you think he is a Chase Edmonds? Do you expect that to be a battle per se?
Well, I mean, I think with any rookie, it's going to come down to understanding how things work. And Chase Edmonds is a smart kid, and he looked pretty good when he got a chance to play last year. So I would think that there would be right now a fairly decent gap between Chase Edmonds and Eno Benjamin, just because Chase Edmonds understands his offense and understands what's going on. So whether or not Eno can make some kind of headway in training camp, I guess we'll have to see. And that's a position where I think you need three good running backs. The chances of all three guys staying 100% healthy all year is not a great one just by math. So Eno Benjamin's going to be needed. But whether he's ahead of Chase Edmonds from the outset, I don't know if I'd buy that right now.
So just based on that little bit of analysis there, Kyle, you kind of get a sense of why a lot of the national media types are jumping on the Cardinals bandwagon. There are not a lot of glaring holes, and we see some pretty good competition that's going to push guys at certain spots. It's why we've seen the Adam Shines of the world, nominate the Cardinals as the most likely, perhaps to go from worst to first, because it's happened every year except twice since 2002, even though the Cardinals are in arguably the most difficult division. I did like seeing Peter King, though. As much as I dislike the offseason power polls, I did like seeing the Cardinals 18th in that power poll, Kyle, just for a little sense of reality, a little bit of a reality check, at least a national media member that's not too much over their skis. And Peter, although Peter King cited some things I don't think are necessarily valid by the end of the year, like the red zone efficiency being 29th in the NFL, the Cardinals were way beyond that. Those numbers were skewed and marred by the month of September. But
Thank you,
give
Paul.
me your sense. Just give me your sense. So you've rubbed off on me a little bit. And then the Peter King sighting, it kind of stuck in my craw a little bit. I'm like John Madden. It's got to be such a good number that I don't have to write it down, that it sticks out and I remember it. Otherwise, the number is superfluous and worthless. That's my approach.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not looking at red zone efficiency from last year as to why this year's team is going to struggle. That's like 98,000th on my list of reasons. I think the defense is a legitimate question. They ranked in the bottom 5 statistically in a lot of categories last year, and they definitely signed some guys, and they drafted Isaiah Simmons, and you can look at it either way. I mean, you can say the pass rush is going to be pretty good because you've got Chandler Jones, and now you added Jordan Phillips. But I kind of wonder on the other side, if Chandler Jones isn't superhuman this season, do you have enough of a pass rush? If he regresses a little bit from a career year, in the secondary, Patrick Peterson, Robert Alford, and Byron Murphy all have talent, and they can all be good cornerbacks, but there's a downside to all three of them that you can easily see, whether it be Patrick Peterson's age or Alford's age and injury history. Byron Murphy hasn't totally proven himself yet. So I think the defense could be either good, bad, or in between. I have no idea yet, but offensively, I'm very optimistic about what they have because of what they showed last year. Because Kyler Murray is still young, you're not worried about any players being past their prime that are like huge key contributors on this team. So I think if Kyler Murray continues to progress like we think he will, I think the Cardinals are going to take a pretty big jump, and it's such a quarterback-dependent league. And I think DeAndre Hopkins coming in is going to help that offense elevate. So I'm optimistic about the team overall, but a lot of it to me depends on Kyler Murray really turning into that star that we think he's going to become.
And without that traditional offseason, obviously we haven't seen Kyler. We don't know, and we're not able to actually get a gauge of how much progress he's made in the offseason. We rely on Cliff Kingsbury. And then the question becomes the head coach himself. Someone who admits he learned so much in his first year as an NFL head coach. Do you think this offseason might have set back the head coach at all, Darren? Is that a valid question? You even wonder how it might have impacted Cliff Kingsbury.
Well, I think in one way it helped him because, and we heard this from Kenyon Drake talking about the mad genius. I mean, I think in one way, giving him a little bit more time to himself to kind of like figure out what might be good in this playbook that I didn't have time to watch this film before because I was doing this or whatever. I think that'll help him, as did the idea that he didn't. I mean, thank goodness this happened this year and not last year when he was trying to figure out the NFL game and having it ruin. I mean, if you're a first-year head coach like Rule down in Carolina, and you're trying to learn the pro game, and this is all happening, that's a tough road to hoe. But I think Cliff is going to come out ahead in that regard. Now, being out on the field, relating to players, I mean, I think he does a pretty good job of that already. But does he lose anything because he doesn't get that on-field time with them right now? Potentially. I mean, I think DeAndre Hopkins is a professional, and so is Cliff Kingsbury, and I think they'll be fine when they get together. But it would have been nice for him to, kind of interact with one of his new star players for, a few practices before we got to training camp.
You know what I think served Cliff Kingsbury really well is that he learned at the NFL level, you don't have to come up with a genius game plan every week. You don't have to have 500 plays on your play sheet every single week. And in doing his coach's show a year ago, I think, and you read between the lines, he came to the realization that Ken Whisenhunt came his first year, even though he had experience as being an NFL play caller. I vividly remember the Cardinals' first game under Ken Whisenhunt at the Niners, Candlestick Park, a close loss, and then later Whisenhunt admitting they had too much in the game plan. And guys weren't playing fast enough. There was too much confusion because of it. And it's such a natural inclination, I would surmise, because you're thinking, I'm at the NFL level, I'm a head coach, I'm the play caller, I have to outthink everyone. Man, we're going to get ultra complex. And then it ends up being a detriment to your own team, not necessarily a challenge for the other team. And I think, Kyle, and maybe even for Vance Joseph a little bit, when you consider that he dialed back some of the schemes in the secondary, guys played better, less was more in the final month of December in a lot of ways when it came to the schemes. Maybe this coaching staff came to that realization. And I think, at least to me, from looking on the outside in, that's going to serve the Cardinals well this year because that's already a lesson learned for the coaches.
And I think in the NFL to succeed, you have to have your bread and butter plays and your bread and butter ideas working at a pretty efficient level in order to work off all that stuff. And I can see some credence to what you're saying, where early on Cliff Kingsbury had a lot of flash, but it lacked substance because they weren't running the ball very well and they weren't, just connecting on just the more general plays, and defenses didn't have to really worry about stuff because they weren't automatically waiting for something and then getting tricked. So I think Cliff Kingsbury certainly learned about that as he went on. And for Cardinals fans, I think they should be very optimistic about him as a coach. I think he showed a ton as a rookie coach on the field, where the offensive personnel 2 seasons ago was historically unproductive, and there were a decent number of guys that came back. And obviously Kyler Murray came in, but he was still a rookie, and this team was clicking pretty well by the end of the season. And I think schematics was a pretty big part of that. So I think he's just going to keep on improving. And the Cardinals took a big risk on Cliff Kingsbury a year and a half ago, and I think they are very happy with what he's become.
Getting back to the whole worst to first thing, and I go back and forth with myself on this, Darren. Okay, is it really viable? Is that realistic? Is that plausible for us to kick that around and pose that as an offseason question for the Arizona Cardinals in the ultra difficult NFC West? And at first, guys, to say, no, come on, from 5 wins to division champ, get real. The NFC champions, NFC West. But wait a minute, the Cardinals didn't play that team to within a single score in both games for the most part. They did go up to Seattle and trounce a Seattle team that might have said they didn't have much to play for and everything was riding on week 17 anyway, if you listen to the 12s. But the Seattle Seahawks defense has been struggling, and they have issues on the offensive line again. They've hit the reset button on their O-line. The Rams, most would seem to say, are on the decline. Then again, Sean McVay is 6-0 against the Cardinals in his career. So it's an honest question for me to you, content provider to content provider. Do you think it's a legitimate question to even pose, are the Cardinals a threat to go from worst to first in the NFC West?
I think it's tough to say worst to first. I mean, from worst to playoff team, I think there's more of an argument there. If this was a division set up where there was one really good team, like if it was the 49ers were really good, but then the Seahawks and Rams were more middling teams, I think it's a different kind of conversation. The fact that you're trying to climb over 3 teams, 2 that made the playoffs last year, and 1, even if they took some steps back, would have made the playoffs given the current playoff situation now where they added a 7th team. I just think that's a lot of ladder rungs to get over to get to first place. I mean, if you're talking about one team, that's one thing. If you're talking about 3 teams, that's a lot to get over. Plus, making sure that you as a team have done everything you've needed to make those steps forward. So I see this team, I don't know if I would be saying worst to first, but I think this team can be in the playoff hunt. And quite frankly, the way everything is gone and the way this roster is set up and the way kind of the mindset seems to be, I think there's going to be some disappointment internally if they aren't in that hunt.
Kyle, are we going to see that? Are we going to see that question entertained in any of your columns on azcardinals.com? Is that going to be a question that you would give any credence to whatsoever?
I think you absolutely have to give credence to it. I mean, look at the division last year. The 49ers were expected to do nothing, and they turn around and win the division and make the Super Bowl, and they were very close to winning it all. So certainly not unprecedented. And even though the division is very tough, all these teams have to play each other. So it's not like if you had 2 patsies, then the best team was just going to beat up on them like you did. So I think that could hurt the 49ers, where they have to play the Seahawks and the Rams and the Cardinals, and you can lose some of those games. So I think it's a legitimate conversation. And if you're talking about from worst to second, I think it's very plausible. But the 49ers, to me, are such a balanced team, such a talented team. They have a really excellent coach. Like, if they lost one player, they're still a really good team. Like, if you're in the Chiefs division and Patrick Mahomes gets hurt, all of a sudden you have hope. But I feel like the Niners are very deep across the board, and they're not reliant on one guy. So that's the hard part. But still, it's the NFL. If the Cardinals came out and won the division in 2020, it wouldn't shock me.
I mean, the Niners won playoff games with their starting quarterback throwing 8 pass attempts, right? So,
yeah.
You know, then again, look what happens traditionally, historically, to the loser of the Super Bowl. And all you have to do is look at the Rams and what happened to LA a year ago. Then again, the Rams are only a year removed from the Super Bowl themselves, just like the Niners are. So, and see, there you go. That's part of the inner conundrum. You go back and forth, the internal struggle as to whether it's even valid to pose that question or not.
And I think just the evidence of teams with quarterbacks on rookie contracts too, where you build up around them and find success, I think that has to be incorporated into this discussion, because the Cardinals are following a blueprint that has shown to be successful numerous times in the past 5 years or so. So I think that's why there should be optimism about this team, because you're not just hoping right now. There's evidence as to why this turnaround can happen.
And to me, one of my biggest takeaways from last year was just the Cardinals at least showed and proved they can compete in the division by winning Week 16 at Seattle, by playing the Niners tough twice. There was the blowout game against the Rams, obviously coming off the bye. That was the most miserable game of the season. We know that. But the Cardinals did rebound, even with a highly restrained Kyler Murray and the leg injury. You know, I think they showed that, okay, you know, they can hang with a Rams team that are really dominated on Sean McVay in those previous affairs. So, you know, to me, that was one of the big – for a 5-win season, I think you did accomplish that you sent a message to the division that you're going to be a tough out, if nothing else. And if you listen to the way those teams talked about the Cardinals after each one of those divisional meetings, with the exception of the Rams Thursday night game, then I think, you know what, they realized that the Cardinals are a different team as well.
I would agree with all that. And ultimately, you know, all this gets determined on the field. And there's so many different things, just like what we say every year about you can't talk about strength of schedule because every year is so different. I mean, you don't know. I mean, God forbid one of the quarterbacks in this division goes down with a significant injury. I mean, I know you just said Garoppolo only threw 8 passes and all that, but if Jimmy Garoppolo goes out with a serious injury the second week of the season, the 49ers are going to have a much different year, quite frankly. I truly believe that. You know, will they be impacted as much as if Seattle lost Russell Wilson? Maybe not. But I mean, you don't know how these things are going to play out, or somebody catches COVID at the wrong time. You know, all these things that we're now facing. Ultimately, going back to your original question of can they go from worst to first, I guess I would agree with Kyle. I don't think it's likely, but I would agree with Kyle that if it ended up happening, would I be shocked? Shocked wouldn't be the right word, because I guess I wouldn't be.
And I never thought we'd go this whole podcast without someone taking a shot at my mustache, but here we are. And I'm about to cut you guys off and just wrap up this edition of Cardinals Underground. So that's good. Although I do have a sneaky suspicion and a theory, and I'm trying to prove this, whether some of the haters out there, there's actually a burner account run by my wife. I think there is a burner account online, and I'm close to proving and tracking that accordingly here at Casa Calvisi. We'll see about that.
Let us know. Let us know.
That's
Sorry,
right.
Paul. It's real life. People hate your mustache. It's not just burner accounts.
But if I was in a bullpen, everyone would love it. It's just amazing with the setting of it, is how that works. All right, there you go. For Kyle Odegard and Darren Urban, Paulie Pandemic here on Cardinals Underground.